Today, we're going to be taking a look at food waste. Food waste is this really, really difficult, pernicious problem in food systems. And we'll talk about kind of, how it impacts our country and our planet in terms of sustainability related issues. And then we'll take a look at what you can do in the K-12 classroom to think about and address food waste. And we're going to try to be a little bit more solutions focused than perhaps I have been in the past couple of days' content. So we'll take a good look at the problem of food waste, but then we'll also examine some of the solutions. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A if anybody has questions about the course or about the topic of the day. We'll take a look at food waste in America and throughout the food system, and then look at how to address food waste with students in terms of audits and reduction strategies. And then I'll share a story briefly with you about food rescue and an approach to making use of wasted food. So let's talk about food waste in America. Around the world, about a third of the food that we produce is wasted every single year. And when we say wasted, it's important to note that actually means two different categories of food that isn't eaten or food that isn't used. And so we'll examine that in just a second. But global food losses and waste per year, it's about a third of the world's food, 1.3 billion tons and approximately $1 trillion in costs. So that's a huge loss. And when we break it down by food type, it's as you can see on the slide, about 45% of fruits and vegetables, 35% of fish and seafood, 30% of cereals, 20% of dairy products, and 20% of meat and poultry. And to be honest, I'm not real sure why there is this difference in these numbers. But one of the things that I do notice is that things like fruits and vegetables, once you buy them and bring them home, right, you're on a timeline to finish them. And that can be a real challenge and contribute to food waste, particularly if it's not stored properly. And most of us really don't know how to store food properly in the refrigerator or in our homes. Food waste and food loss are what contribute to that 1/3 of food that doesn't make it to humans. And the definition of these is slightly different. So food waste, which is the bigger portion of the loss, is what happens when edible food is discarded prematurely or unnecessary. So that's like the stuff that gets to your house, goes in your refrigerator, and then you throw it away. Whereas food loss happens when food is damaged or destroyed before the consumer can eat it. And so that's like supply chain problems where food that's being grown is left in the field to rot, or it makes it to a distribution center, but there's nowhere to take it from there. Oftentimes, this is more prevalent in developing nations where they may have a harder time growing crops in the field and getting those crops to consumers. And then, not shockingly, America leads the world in per capita food waste. And one of the things that I think is really important to remember is that food waste is most prevalent in affluent countries like America, countries in Europe, et cetera. So, you can speculate about what that means or why that is the case, but think about your own consumption and patterns. If you are relatively certain that you can access food and buy food whenever you need to, maybe it contributes to a bit of laziness when it comes to using what you have in your refrigerator or at home. And that may be part of the problem. And as some of you mentioned in the poll, overconsumption or portion sizes too, those contribute as well. So what does that look like? I mean, food just rotting in landfills. 103 million tons of food waste is generated by the US in 2018. And that's the equivalent to over 450,000 statues of liberty. The average American family of four throws out about $1,500 worth of food each year. And we do it just sort of casually and without really doing any examination or thinking about what contributes to that. I grew up in a household where you just never wasted food. I sort of mentioned my 6-word definition of sustainability being that, what would your Depression era granny do? And my grandmother on my father's side and my mother's side are both just incredibly frugal and conscientious about food. So they don't make more food than we'll eat. That's not true. My grandmother on my mother's side is a typical Latina grandmother. She makes way more food than anybody will ever eat. The difference is she makes you eat it. So whereas on my father's side, my grandmother would just never let you waste food either, but she controlled that by portion sizes and only made what would be used. And saved everything. So everything went back into the freezer or the refrigerator after it wasn't eaten. But this is a real problem for most families. We just sort of throw away food, as a matter of convenience. And meanwhile, we have this tremendous amount of food waste. And meanwhile, 54 million people in the country are food insecure. And this picture comes from impromptu food banks that were set up during the pandemic to get food to folks who had low access to food to begin with. And then when that was disrupted by the pandemic, had no way to get food. And so food insecurity, a huge problem we talked about yesterday. And, it really should cause us to think about food waste and to do our best to make our food waste, the food that is not eaten, get to people instead of the landfill, which is where most of it ends up. So let's think about the impacts, going back to some of the models of sustainability that we have examined: environmental, social, economic. What are the impacts for food waste? So to do this, I want to do a little thought experiment. And this doesn't come from me. I really wish I had thought of this myself, but it's actually something that was introduced to me by a researcher at the School of Sustainability. So this researcher's name is Chris Wharton. He studies food systems, and he's really interested in kind of stories of excess and overconsumption. And so he thinks about the food system through the lens of how is it designed to lead to overconsumption. And just this is an interesting little thought experiment. So let's say you're in a rush to get to school one day, get to work. So you didn't get your breakfast, so you stop at a convenience store and buy a Snickers bar. Delicious, delicious Snickers bar for your breakfast, right? And you're trying to navigate the parking lot to get back to your car and open the food at the same time. And if you've ever done this and gotten distracted, you know what happens. You're going to drop your Snickers bar on the ground. All right. So there's our thought experiment. Now, what do? Do you eat it? Do you pick it up and dust it off and eat it? Or do you just go, well, that sucks, and throw it away and go and buy another one? And the reason I ask this question is I have this sense that one of the things that, our sort of systems of excess lead to is just devaluing the food that we have. So like, say you didn't get your breakfast, say you didn't get your breakfast, why are you opting for a Snickers bar? First of all, like, how have we devalued food so that like a candy bar is a substitute for something that we didn't, an important meal? And then as Christina kind of put in the chat, I wouldn't be eating candy, but if it was a piece of fruit, yeah, that's the way I think about it too. Like if I dropped a candy bar, I just be like, I don't really need the candy. But if I dropped, an apple or something, I would pick it up and I would dust it off and I would eat it because I feel like there's more value to the apple, I guess. So let's put this into the context of food waste and see if I can communicate what I'm thinking here with this thought experiment. So for those of you that said pitch it, the shockingly small portion of you that would throw food that's touched the ground. What about all those resources that went into making your food? And you can apply this question to any food that gets thrown out. So you go to a fancy restaurant and you don't eat everything on your plate and it gets thrown away. Or you're cleaning out your refrigerator once a week and you find all of the vegetables that you purchased that didn't make it through the week and didn't get consumed. What went into making that food? So this is where we think of a life cycle analysis, and it's important for that life cycle analysis to inform us about the resources in our food. So all along the production of food and use of food, there's extraction of resources from water and soil. There's the processing and manufacturing of food from the crops that we grow, like corn and wheat, into processed foods like cereal and chips and things like that. There's packaging and transportation, and there's how it's used in the end of life. And along that, every step of that life cycle, there's considerable food waste. In some places more than others, as we'll see in just a bit. But there's also lots and lots of resources that go into it. So as stuff is being driven around, there's fossil fuels being used. As when food is packaged, it's packaged in cardboard or plastic often, or foil. And all of those are resources that are, maybe not reflected in the $1.25 that you paid for that Snickers bar, because there are government subsidies behind them. So maybe you would throw away a Snickers bar because it only costs $1.25, but there's still a ton of resources that may not be reflected in that cost. So let's take a look at what that means in terms of food waste. So the US wastes tons of resources whenever it wastes food. And if we do a survey of the life cycle of food that is thrown away, what we find are numbers like this. So let's talk about greenhouse gas emissions. This is the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced when food is transported. It's also the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced when food goes to landfill and starts to rot. When it breaks down in landfill conditions where there's no oxygen, it breaks down into methane, which is a really problematic greenhouse gas. And there's enough greenhouse gas produced by food that we throw away to power 37 million vehicles worth. That's for a year. And so that's a huge problem, right? Like if we wouldn't be throwing away the gasoline that is used to power cars, but because it's food that we didn't use, we feel differently about it. It's also important to think of the water that is captured in our food. And some food uses way more water than other foods. So in general, meat and dairy use orders of magnitude more water than produce, for example. And even when you compare things like regular milk to almond milk or soy milk, you might remember a few years back all the controversy about California almond groves using up water. The water footprint for plant-based milk is a sliver. It's a fraction of what is used to produce dairy and milk from cows. So overall, it's 21% of our total agricultural water usage, which is just a huge chunk, right? That 21% of the water that we use is embedded in the food that we throw away. We have enough calories in the food that is thrown away to meet half of the recommended daily intake for adults, for the adult population in our country. And if you think about that differently, remember that 54 million people who are food insecure, capturing food waste and making sure it gets to people would basically eliminate that problem. And then we would have food left over. 19% of all US croplands are used to produce the food that we throw away. And that is more than all of the land in New Mexico. So an entire state's worth of land is going to food that is eventually thrown away. And it's the biggest single component of our landfill. So if we evaluate our trash, 21% of our trash is food waste. 18% of the fertilizers that we use end up being wasted. And it's about 1/3 of the US gross domestic product. So huge, huge, huge amounts of money, 218 billion dollars in money wasted. Monica says that's depressing. It really is. It's really sad, but at the same time, it's not an impossible situation for us to address. So we are going to take a look at some of those solutions. But first, some more depressing. So in 2018, more food reached landfills and combustion facilities than any other single material in everyday trash. 24% of the trash that was sent to landfills was food waste. 22% of the trash that was combusted for energy recovery was food. And if we expand this globally and think about food waste globally, if food loss and waste were a country, they would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. So food that's going to landfill or ending up rotting in fields is responsible for enough greenhouse gases that it would be, the third largest greenhouse gas emitter on the planet. That's huge. That's a huge environmental impact. And then, of course, a $1 trillion global food waste cost. Here's just a breakdown of that: $31,700 per second. So massive, massive problem. So who's wasting food the most? When it comes to food, food waste, any place that grows food, sells food, eats food, food is wasted there. And so it's a system-wide problem. It's not just a problem in your home or in restaurants. It's everywhere. So the biggest chunk is residential food use. Food is wasted when we put it in the refrigerator and forget about it, obviously, or when we cook too much and throw away the leftovers. Restaurants are slightly better. Grocery stores are very efficient, as are sort of institutions like that might be a school or an organization that has a has a cafeteria that provides food for their employees. One of the things that I learned very early in doing food waste audits in schools is that the back of the house, the cafeteria services, they have basically no food waste. They're very, very lean when it comes to food waste because they have to make sure that it gets to students. But in front of the house, the front of house where the kids are getting the food, way, way, way more food. Like, so 90% of the food waste comes from kids after they get their food from the cafeteria, not eating it and just pitching it. And then about 2% is industrial. So even though there is food waste in places like slaughterhouses or meat processing plants in farms, they're pretty efficient still.